Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ned, for the invitation, for the Center for the Study on Capitalism, for bringing us all together, for Lizzie for organizing everything so well. It's an honor to follow Glenn. I just sent a paper to you, actually, that I thought might be interesting given your Bush story. And I'm going to be speaking on similar themes, but from a radically different perspective. And so in some ways, you may get a sense from me what it would be like to be in the room with some of Glenn's students as they think about the problems of capitalism and certain sets of things that we have to answer for. Here, I'm going to speak from my position, both doing historical work and sociological work, and thinking about some of the ways in which capitalism has been implicated in some of the great harms of the last 300 years. I'll just note quickly that I could have given the same account on the side of the public sector. And so there would be a way to talk about everything, and I'll point along each side, but given that I'm on the left side of the program and I was asked to talk particularly about the private sector, that's what I'll do, and I'll point to some of the same public sector problems. So the first thing I'll note, and this relates to some of Glenn's points about growth, is capitalism's intimate role in the climate crisis. And how, if we were to think about what has happened over the last 300 to 400 years, one analogy we could use is that we dug up a bunch of things that had previously died, turned into fuel and other kinds of things, and we threw them into the air. And in throwing them into the air, we had catastrophic effects upon climate. In some ways, the model of growth that was spoken about earlier is part of the challenge for addressing this very issue. And the United States is particularly bad in regard to this. The speed of capitalism in creating reforms is quite fast, but not nearly fast enough to address it. And the world that we enjoy, and in particular the wealth that we enjoy in this room, in our homes, et cetera, is in some ways predicated on the displacement of millions of people. I say this actually in a deeply personal way. My father is from Pakistan. He's from a village in Pakistan. 30 million people lost their homes recently. They lost them in part because of a failure of government infrastructure in Pakistan, but they primarily lost them because in our constant search for growth, what we effectively did was massively destabilize the environment, create conditions that were likely to lead to considerable flooding. And this 30 million people is but a small glimpse of what we are likely to see. We may lose the nation of Bangladesh. We are likely to see within Pakistan tens of millions of people continually being displaced from their homes. And the scale of this is difficult for us to conceptualize, in part because I think, and this returns to a little bit of the question of Adam Smith, a failure of empathy or what the scope conditions are where we think we have obligations. Well, I'll leave it on this. It's not going to get any better, just as a flag. The other thing to recognize is that capitalism played an intimate role in slavery. And that this happened both in the United States and on a global scale. That slavery was a highly profitable institution that many capitalist countries participated in. And actually, this is missing from the Adam Smith story, who considers a little bit of it in Moral Sentiments, doesn't consider it at all in 1776, by the time Wealth of Nations is published. And yet the English economy has profoundly transformed by 1800, basically around not just the slave trade, but the consequences of the slave trade. If you look at the percentage of English GDP that was basically exchanged with Europe, it was around 60% in 1700. That changes radically by 1800. And we should remember that the slave trade was not an early thing, say 1600s, that by the 1700s, when we develop a new sort of set of economic forms we move away from, it actually aggressively accelerated through that period in time. It's important to note that slavery had a significant impact on population growth throughout England. So here I cite a paper of an economist who shows that slavery, if you were a port city, was much more important for economic growth than the printing press, which is something we think of as massively important. Now, I wouldn't just point to England here, and I'll note that, yes, England gets rid of the slave trade in 1808, but they don't get rid of slavery until the 1830s. I think the Slave Act in England is 1833. By the time they actually eliminate the ownership of slaves, it's 1843. And when they do that, they dedicate, and I apologize I can't see my notes here, but I think it's around 20 million pounds. And as a percentage of GDP, I believe, I'm going to say it's 15%. That could be wrong. I'll correct myself at some point in time today. On remuneration for people who own slaves. So it wasn't like they just got rid of the trade. They actually paid a group of people to not do this. Oh, whoops. In the United States case, capitalism was also intimately involved in ethnic cleansing. We typically think about the Jackson story of the removal of native peoples off lands, as a story of politics, and it certainly was. It was a story of populist politics at the time, but it's important for us to remember that the Old South was not the Old South, that the vision that we have of Dixie as this place where there were plantations was actually an artifact of, to a non-trivial degree, Northern bankers who were very, very involved in the construction of slave plantations and forced labor camps all throughout the American South. And the way that they did this was to work very hard to displace native peoples who primarily lived in the Southern Americas. So while we today think of Indians as people who live in the Midwest and West, many of them lived in the American South. So in Jackson, taking over 25 million acres of land from these native peoples, what we did was invest millions of dollars in the conversion of that land into forced labor camps with Black Americans serving as slaves within those camps. That happened through Northern investment, and it proved to be enormously popular. I mean, popular and profitable. I would note that the profits from this paid for basically the beginnings of the New York subway system that we ride on all the time. And so I took a train up here from 79th Street, and I thought about this as I was on my way to this conference. It's also important to note that the largest asset that was in the United States at this time period were human people, slaves, in fact. And so when we think about this, when we think about the relationship between, say, capitalism and ethnic cleansing, capitalism and slavery, it's important to note that, like, much of this is the basis both of current suffering and current financial advantage. The critiques that we saw upon the passing of Elizabeth about the role of the royal family in this trade and the profitability they extracted from it were important parts of a national conversation about where it is that our money comes from. Here, I in some ways move away from the initial charge, which is to think about the present and the present conditions of capitalism, but I think it's important for us to note that this is part of the foundation that it's built on. I'll also just quickly note, Glenn mentioned the GI Bill. We can also look at the Social Securities Act, which were significant bridges, but they were also bridges that had tolls or exclusion criteria for a lot of people. So in particular, Native Americans and Black workers, I think it was over 60% of Black workers were excluded from the Social Security Act. The Homestead Act further accelerated the ethnic cleansing of Americans. This was both an economic and a political policy, government policy. Again, I could be on the right side of our presentation here. What I want us to think about is then what was this initial foundation that much was built upon. Here, you could think about this extension through the work of my former colleague. I am now at Princeton, but my first job was here at Columbia, and I spent the first 13 years of my career here. So my former colleague, Manning Marable, who outlined the profitability of racism to the United States. And this runs against what classic economic theorists would tell us about the costs of racism, that racism is exceptionally costly within labor markets because in having a racial preference, you have to pay more for labor. But as it turns out, there's a lot of evidence for the profitability of racism for capital. Marable does this in his classic text, and more recently, Chris Muller has done an enormous amount of work sort of indicating how, after Reconstruction, racist policies led to considerable profits and considerable advantage. So here, we could look at when it was that racial disparities and imprisonment began. Now, often when we tell the story of racial disparities and imprisonment, we focus on the drug war. the drug war kind of matters, but it doesn't matter nearly as much as we think. First, because the drug war has a lot of flow of people into prison, but actually there's a considerable stock of people in prison who are not part of the drug war. So often the statistics that we see about it are deceptive. We underestimate the amount of violent crime in the United States, for example. But another is to see when it was that racial disparities in imprisonment emerged. And they primarily emerged first in the North, not the South, as Black Americans migrated during the Great Migration, but we also see them emerging in the South. So in the North, the story is, Muller tells a pretty convincing story from my perspective, which shows that as Black Americans move north, in contexts where white ethnics have control over police power, you see significant increases in racial disparity. So this is a story of the other part of my family heritage, which is that my mother is from Ireland, and when Irish people controlled the police force in the North, you found significantly higher rates of imprisonment for Black Americans. The explanation that Muller gives for this, that he doesn't really have a lot of evidence for, because in some ways it's very difficult to have evidence for, but his conceptual claim is that labor market competition was something that happened as blacks moved north, and that labor market competition was deeply ethnic in character, and that ethnic whites used their control over the state to punish migrant blacks and to move them out of the labor force. This is not a story of capitalism. This is a story of interethnic competition in labor markets and how imprisonment is the likely consequence of that. The second story that we see, though, is in the South, where in the South there was almost no black prisoners. So if you look basically before 1865 and you look to see the categorization of prisoners, there is no category for colored, which is kind of astonishing. And then after 1865, you begin to see the emergence of that category. Now, this shouldn't be too surprising to us because of the other forms of state violence and corporate violence against people if they caused harm, that it may not have actually been mediated through the state. But one of the things that we see is that after the war, you get an increase of imprisonment rate of 12-fold for Black Americans throughout the South, and that in the areas where that happens are in areas where Black Americans begin to have greater labor market power and greater economic power. And a coalition between actors begins to mobilize against Black Americans, in effect, to imprison them. Now, this is a labor market story that involves working class ethnic whites, elite Northerners, elite Southerners, the role of the state, but also an interest in cheap labor, which these racial stories are an important part of. I'll note that capitalism is still predatory, and that when we think about this account that I've just given you, you could be like, it's very easy for us to be like, yes, we engage in ethnic cleansing. Like there used to be 5 million Native Americans, we got that number down to 250,000, we killed a lot of them, we moved them mostly off their lands, but like, that's not the case anymore. Or yes, there were all of these racial disparities, but like, that is not what capitalists do today. And I would suggest that that's not true. That if we look at something like eviction, so my current colleague in Princeton, Matt Desmond, who also was my closest friend in graduate school, we shared an advisor, works a lot on processes of eviction and has incredible data from his eviction lab on sort of making this an object of interest. What we see increasingly is a growth of not just private equity, but LLC home ownership. And that as corporations move into neighborhoods, they primarily move into more minority-dense neighborhoods and poorer neighborhoods to acquire housing. And there's a lot of evidence of the negative harms of this. Some of the negative harms suggest, and I'm just gonna have to read from here, I apologize to look down, significant rent increases over time, significant increases in fees, increases in eviction rates on considerable orders of magnitude. The number of tenants who fall behind increases, and a recent set of research not done by Desmond but done by Travis showing that there's a significant decrease in investment in homes as corporate entities buy them. So this is just looking to see, in some ways it's an ecological account, but it looks at how many permits people look to gather as they in different neighborhoods, and then looks at the proportion of not just private equity, but LLC-owned homes in those neighborhoods. And what you see is significant declines in permits for doing renovations to homes as LLCs buy these things. And so here, again, we have a kind of story of predatory capitalism in primarily poor and minoritized neighborhoods. The story, some of this information comes from a recent House Finance Committee report. That report focuses primarily on illegal evictions during the eviction moratorium during COVID. And that tends to be sort of the major part of the conversation right now. And, yes, it's terrible, 77,000 to 125,000 people who were evicted in this time period when they shouldn't have been. That's obviously a problem. But actually there are some larger problems with the way in which this institution tends to be considerably predatory. I'm going to go here through some really well-trodden things. This is a recent CBO, Congressional Budget Office, account of, if you look at family wealth in the United States and what's happened since, I think they're looking, I'm going to look today from both 89 or 87 and 76, I think. This basically shows that the bottom half of the United States only owns 2% of the total wealth in the country, and that it's dropped from 4% in the 80s, and that the top 10% has grown considerably in that time period. More specifically, and I would say that the CBO's report is actually pretty bad here because they look at averages, and we shouldn't be looking at averages. We should be looking at medians. It's not conceivable that the top 10% average is 6 million. That's clearly wrong. Or rather, the tail is really pulling this considerably. But we see a dramatic story here in what's happened. And I would say it's important, because I suspect, even though there's a lot of economists in the room, Suresh Naidu's work has shown that, I think the econ profession is 80% Democrat. So, most of you are pretty liberal. This is a bipartisan story, and I'll show that again and again. It doesn't matter who's president, it doesn't matter who's in Congress. We can't just say, oh, the Republicans and what they've done to the tax code. It's been a range of actors that have produced this fairly consistent outcome. And in fact, I'll show you that wealth disparities increased the most considerably under the Obama administration. And if we look at the Obama recovery from the economic collapse in 2008-9 through 2014, we basically see that 108% of the recovery goes to the top 10% of earners, which is to say that not only did they get all of the recovery, they got some from other people as well. The other way of looking at this is the classic Piketty-Sias distribution. And there's all kinds of issues with this. I'm going to address one of the issues, which is conditional tax transfers and other things within it. But if we just look at the top, the median, the middle 40%, the average person, the bottom 50, the top 1, the top 0.1, the story is really dramatic. I'd note here that recessions tend to be equality building events. And if we think of recessions as equality building events, we might then wonder a little bit about equality as a measure all the time. But nonetheless, it's important to recognize that that economic growth since the 70s, really since 1974, has been disproportionate in income growth. And you might be interested, well, what about wealth? Or what if we take into account other forms of tax transfers? So what happens to that number of the bottom 50%? It doubles. So you can look to see a different kind of thing for income growth, taking into account taxes. I'll just note that actually the income of the top 0.01% increases from 528% to 533%. That's because if anybody here owns your own home, and you have a mortgage, in all likelihood, you get more housing support from the government than anybody who's poor. I certainly do. I own a home in Princeton, and the tax benefits that I get from that house are considerably more than what any poor person gets for their housing benefits just out of a mortgage interest deduction. until the Trump administration got rid of SALT, there was also additional ways that people who lived in liberal areas were able to claim considerable shares of taxes and tax transfers, often more than what poor people receive. But this tells a fairly consistent story here, and that consistent story, from my perspective, is a story of unequal development. Now, you may say to yourself, well, this is growth, right? And what we can expect under conditions of growth is something like this, and I don't care about inequality. What I care about is growth. Just by the way, this was my bipartisan consensus looking at some estimates of the effects of the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, and then looking at wealth growth. And for those of you who are looking at the wealth numbers, I just want to point out that the steepest rises that we see in this position are like during the Obama years. So that to me is not an indictment of Obama. It's to say that like Obama was a continuation of the status quo of previous years, and that we often make a big distinction between these two political parties as if they're having radically different effects on this story. And what I see across all of these is in effect a straight line, basically a straight line with some drops during periods of recession. Yes, inequality matters. So if you say to me, all I care about is growth, I don't care about inequality, I would first point out to you that predictions, and this is based upon some estimates that Sheldon Denzinger and co-author, who I forget, I apologize, they're probably listed here, did about the impact of different factors on increases in poverty, or really what I would describe as not increases in poverty, the persistence of poverty in America. And what this shows is that inequality has by far the most dominant effect on the persistence of poverty in America. So if you don't care about inequality, this is a hard story for you to think through. I would also say that if you only care about growth and you think like inequality and mobility are things that are unrelated to one another, I would note that if we look in different areas and we look using Chetty data about the impact of the Gini coefficient on mobility, there's a really clear story here for those of you who don't have a background in this. What it basically shows is that like as inequality increases, mobility declines. This is in different regions. And there are clear causal pathways for this. Some of them are indirect and some of them are direct. One of the causal pathways that's a direct causal pathway is the rise of residential segregation, and the associated second pathway would be unequal educational opportunities as a result of it. But there are also direct effects of inequality. I mean, if you just think for a moment about children as assets rather than people, and I used to live at 21 Claremont here, and there was like a lovely place for little kids to go as a nursery school and things like that. And I forget what it cost, but I think it was $30,000 a year. And that was for like 4 days a week and a half day on Friday. And that's a lot of money to pour into a kid. And there are times where people pour more and more and more and more money into kids. And so one of the things that we see with inequality, especially inequality growing at the top, is that the very wealthy are able to pour significantly more into their children than others. I would say that actually what's astonishing to me is how costly it is and what the low rate of return is on this differential investment in kids. Like that's a really notable story to me. But I would also note that the lack of opportunity for those in poverty is not a separate problem from the distribution of wealth and income in the United States. So in this case, what I've said is, what do we have to answer for? And I actually put myself in this story, is what we have to answer for is the ethnic cleansing and slavery that capital was a part of, and its continued legacy today, the legacy of climate change and a question of who we owe and what we owe to them, increasing economic disparities and limited mobility, and continued financial predation on poor and minoritized communities. I am not a policy person, so you're going to be very disappointed with me about like what should we do about it. My answer would not be, oh, well, what we need is socialism, because I suspect some people will say to me, but this isn't really capitalism, right? Real capitalism is something different. And I would say to you, like, I respect that claim about as much as I respect the claims where people say to me, Stalin and Pol Pot, they weren't really communism. You can't indict communism because of how it's actually been lived in a place. Ideally, it's much better. And I would say I'm not really super respectful of either of those positions. We have to think about our economic system not as we want it to be, but as it's lived. Thank you very much. I can't quite hear you, but I can repeat.
Okay,
there we go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Richard, Rob, let me try to give some brief answers to your questions.
Yeah.
Although we don't set ourselves out to be apologists or defenders of capitalism, but I'd like to try. First, I think ethnic cleansing has been a feature of human life, even before human life, as Homo sapiens wiped out competing species. And my own ancestors were victims of ethnic cleansing under fascism in Europe, and I think you'd have some work to do to show that it happens more often under capitalist societies than elsewhere. In terms of climate change, yes, it's true that capitalist economies, like non-capitalist economies, use a lot of carbon, but we will be the first to convert to a post-fossil fuel economy run on hydrogen, and maybe we'll be able to boast of that in 10 years. I think I don't have a short answer to the increasing disparities, other than to say it's a very complicated subject, and our own journal, Capitalism Society, has weighed in on this. It's a question of data. There are many ways to look at this, and we all care about inequality. We can't be dismissed to say that that's not a concern. We care about equality, we care about poverty, we care about whether people have enough material possessions to live a good life, but it's far from simple. And in terms of financial predation of institutionally owned multifamily housing, I happen to be seated next to an expert on this topic, Brooke Painter, and maybe ask him to weigh in on this. Because I think some of the claims may be a little simplistic.
Yeah, Brooke Painter. Thanks, Richard.
Mm-hmm.
I invest in multifamily properties, and our experience is a little different than how you describe. Not in Atlanta, by the way, and I don't know the source of the data, and I'm not familiar with the studies. But I've seen in a lot of these markets where there are a lot of investments in this housing, rents rise, but they rise commensurate, obviously, with the market, but also as a result of significant upgrades, particularly in older housing stock, multifamily or single family. In parts of the country, I've seen in Florida, I've seen in Carolinas, in Arizona, Texas. So at least, again, I'm not familiar with your data, but I've seen the market work the other way.
Yep, I'm happy to share. This is the data come from a variety of sources. The Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta did a study of this. These data are from Atlanta, Boston, Denver as primary places. The overall account of this comes from a 2021 report from the Financial Services Committee of the House, which I'm also happy to share. I wouldn't claim that this is every single LLC-owned property, but I would note that in the Travis study, what they look at is across all, I think they look at 2,000-something census tracts where they're able to get data. The effect is non-trivial of a decline in applications for permits to do changes. I would also say that not all LLC ownership is the same, that much of this story has been focused on, in particular, private equity acquisitions and 5 large firms that are doing it. I don't know that I want to reply to the sort of, because I think it's just a difference of opinion, right? Or a different of perspective. I would just say, none of my arguments would be that there's something unique under capitalism about slavery or ethnic cleansing. It's just that they've actively participated in the processes. They may have even done so at a lower rate than other communities. That to me is sort of beside the point, in part because I think we still deal with the long-term impacts of this, and that our 2 poorest groups in the United States have been deeply impacted by this. And it was both a state level policy and not a Southern story, but actually deeply a Northern story as well, with banks and capitalists funding this thing. And so, yeah, sure, we could talk about different rates, but I would say this is the reality of what happened in the United States. Thank you.